Sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't facing death. It's choosing to save a stranger when the world has forgotten what mercy means. In the mountains, where cold kills faster than any sword, leaving someone behind wasn't cruelty, it was survival. Jorund the Graywolf knew these rules better than most. The giant Viking had walked these frozen peaks for years, with only his wolf Skarr for company. When the blizzard hit that night, most men would have found shelter and waited for dawn. But through the driving snow, Jorund saw them, two elderly figures stumbling through drifts that reached their waists. An old couple, abandoned by their clan, facing certain death in the storm. Jorund could have walked past. Instead, he stepped forward and spoke 3 simple words that would change everything. "Follow me now." What he discovered about these strangers would shake him to his very core. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carved through the mountain pass like the breath of angry gods, carrying with it the promise of death for any fool enough to venture into its path. Yet here was Jorund the Graywolf, standing firm against nature's fury, as if he were carved from the same stone that formed these ancient peaks. His massive frame, draped in layers of wolf pelts and weathered leather, moved with the careful precision of a man who had learned to read the mountain's moods like runes on stone. At his side, Skarr pressed close, the grey wolf's keen eyes scanning the swirling white for threats that existed beyond the storm itself. The animal's presence was more than companionship. It was the last thread connecting Jorund to a world he had chosen to leave behind 15 winters ago. Together, they had carved out an existence in this harsh wilderness where most men would have perished within days. Jorund's fingers found the wolf-tooth amulet hanging from his neck, worn smooth by decades of unconscious touching. His grandfather had carved it, back when Jorund still had a name other than the one these mountains had given him. The tooth held warmth even in the bitter cold, as if some spark of the old man's spirit still dwelt within the yellowed bone. It was one of the few reminders of who he had been before he became the hermit of Eldfjall. The storm showed no mercy tonight, but Jorund had learned to find shelter in the mountain's hidden places, caves that most eyes would miss, overhangs that could break the wind's killing edge. He had been heading toward one such refuge when movement caught his attention through the driving snow. At first, he thought it might be deer, lost and desperate in the blizzard. But the shapes moved wrong, too upright, too deliberate in their stumbling progress. 2 figures, barely visible through the white curtain, fought their way through drifts that reached their thighs. Even from a distance, Jorund could see the futility of their struggle. The storm was winning, and these strangers, whoever they were, had perhaps an hour before the cold claimed them permanently. The practical part of his mind, honed by years of solitary survival, whispered the harsh truth. Saving them would put his own life at risk. Resources were precious in winter, and taking on 2 additional mouths to feed could mean the difference between surviving until spring and joining the mountain's collection of frozen corpses. The wilderness had taught him that sentiment was a luxury that killed as surely as any blade. Yet something in their movement spoke to a deeper part of him, a voice he had thought silenced long ago. The way the larger figure sheltered the smaller one, the stubborn refusal to give up despite impossible odds. It reminded him of values he had once held sacred before the world had shown him how little such principles mattered. As he drew closer, details emerged from the storm's chaos. An elderly man, his beard white with frost and age, supported a woman who could barely stand. Their clothing marked them as travelers, but not the kind who usually ventured into these remote passes. There was something deliberate about their presence here, as if they had been seeking this particular path rather than stumbling upon it by chance. The woman's collapse into the snow decided the matter. Jorund moved forward, his voice cutting through the wind like an axe through wood. "Follow me now," he commanded, extending his hand toward the old man. There was no time for explanation, no luxury of debate. The storm would not wait for politeness. The stranger's eyes, pale blue and startlingly alert despite his exhaustion, met Jorund's with a mixture of desperation and something else. Recognition. No, that was impossible. Jorund had lived as a hermit for too long to be known by random travelers. "Eira," the old man whispered, gathering the unconscious woman in his arms. "Can you save her?" The name meant nothing to Jorund, but the anguish in the stranger's voice carried the weight of deep love and longer commitment. These were not random wanderers who had lost their way. The quality of their clothing, though travel-stained, spoke of once comfortable circumstances. The woman's hands, even blue with cold, showed the soft calluses of someone who worked with delicate tools rather than the rough scars of manual labor. "Who are you?" Jorund asked as he helped the man lift his burden. "I am Torvald," came the reply, followed by a pause heavy with meaning. "And this is my wife, Eira. We were, keepers of the old knowledge." The words struck Jorund strangely, stirring memories he could not quite grasp. Keepers of the old knowledge. There had been such people once, respected elders who maintained the traditions and wisdom that kept communities alive through hard winters and harder times. But those days were long past, weren't they? The world had moved beyond such quaint customs. As they struggled through the deepening drifts toward Jorund's hidden cabin, he found himself studying his unexpected companions more carefully. Despite their current predicament, there was a dignity about them that spoke of lives lived with purpose. Eira, even unconscious, maintained an elegant bearing that suggested noble birth or high standing within her community. Torvald moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling precious things. The cabin materialized from the storm like a gift from the gods themselves, low, sturdy, and built into a natural depression that offered protection from the wind's worst fury. Jorund had spent 3 seasons constructing it, using techniques learned from his grandfather and refined through bitter experience. Every log had been chosen for its strength, every joint sealed against the mountain's attempts to reclaim what he had built. Inside, the warmth hit them like a physical force. Jorund's fire had been banked, but not extinguished, the coals glowing red in the stone hearth he had built with his own hands. The interior was Spartan's by most standards, but rich in the things that mattered for survival. Dried meat hanging from the rafters, herbs bundled against one wall, tools maintained to perfection, and furs enough to keep a man warm through the longest winter night. Skarr padded inside behind them, shaking snow from his thick coat before settling near the fire with the contentment of an animal returning to familiar territory. The wolf's acceptance of the strangers surprised Jorund. Usually, Skarr was suspicious of any human presence other than his master's. Torvald helped Jorund lay Eira near the fire, and in the flickering light, Jorund could see how close to death she had come. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale as fresh snow. Hypothermia had its claws deep in her, and without immediate action, she would not see another sunrise. Moving with practiced efficiency, Jorund began the work of saving a life. He heated stones in the fire, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them against Eira's core to warm her gradually. He prepared a tea from herbs he had gathered and dried himself, willow bark for the pain that would come when feeling returned to her extremities, elderflower to fight any fever, and honey to restore strength. As he worked, Torvald watched with the intensity of a man studying a master craftsman. "You know the healing ways," the old man observed. "A man learns what he must to survive alone," Jorund replied, not looking up from his patient. But even as he spoke, he wondered where exactly he had learned these techniques. The knowledge felt deeper than mere survival skills, rooted in something more formal than trial and error. "Not all men," Torvald said quietly. "Most would have left us to die." Jorund had no answer for that. The decision to help them had been instinctive, bypassing the rational calculations that governed most of his Ibam choices. Perhaps 15 years of solitude had not killed the man he had once been as thoroughly as he had believed. As the night deepened and Era's breathing grew stronger, Torvald began to speak. His voice carried the practiced cadence of a storyteller, weaving words with the same skill that Jorund used to shape wood or stone. He spoke of the old ways, when communities were bound together by shared traditions and mutual dependence. He told of the Seer's Circle, a group of learned elders who preserved not just knowledge but wisdom, the understanding of how that knowledge should be used. "We were the last," Torvald said, his voice heavy with loss. "Ira and I, the final keepers of traditions that stretched back to the first settling of these lands. Our people grew tired of the old ways, said they were no longer needed in a world that prized strength over wisdom." Jorund found himself drawn into the old man's words despite his usual resistance to such talk. There was something familiar about the stories Torvald told, as if he were hearing echoes of tales once known but long forgotten. "They cast us out 3 days ago," Torvald continued. "Said we were dead weight, too old to contribute anything of value. They left us with nothing but the clothes on our backs and told us to find our own way." The cruelty of it struck Jorund like a physical blow. To abandon elders in winter was tantamount to murder, a violation of the most basic human decency. Yet he knew such things happened more often now, as communities struggled with scarce resources and hard choices. "You said you were keepers of knowledge," Jorund said, surprising himself by engaging in the conversation. "What kind of knowledge?" Torvald's eyes brightened, and he reached into his travel pack with careful reverence. From its depths, he withdrew a leather pouch, worn smooth by generations of handling. Inside were stones, small, flat pieces of slate carved with symbols that seemed to dance in the firelight. "Rune stones," Torvald said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Each one carved by masters of the old craft, imbued with the wisdom of ages. They speak of bloodlines and destinies, of paths taken and paths yet to be walked." Era stirred then, her eyes fluttering open for the first time since they had arrived. She was older than Jorund had initially thought, perhaps 60 winters or more, but her gaze held the clarity of someone half her age. When she looked at him, he felt as if she were seeing through to his very soul. "The wolf-bearer," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that still howled outside. "The one who walks alone but was born to lead." Her words sent a chill through Jorund that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. He touched the amulet at his throat unconsciously, feeling its familiar weight with new awareness. "You're delirious from the cold," he said, but even as he spoke the words, he knew they rang false. There was too much certainty in Era's voice, too much specific knowledge in her gaze. "Show him," Torvald urged his wife gently. "Show him what the stones revealed before we left." With trembling hands, Ira cast the runes onto the fur where she lay. They fell in a pattern that seemed random to Jorund's eyes, but both elders leaned forward with intense focus, reading meaning in the arrangement of carved symbols. "The wolf," Era pointed to one stone, "strength in solitude, but solitude as a choice rather than a curse." Her finger moved to another. "The broken shield, protection lost, family scattered." A third stone drew her attention. "And here, the crown beneath the mountain, nobility hidden, birthright obscured." Jorund felt his world shifting beneath him like snow before an avalanche. "I don't understand what you're suggesting." "We're not suggesting anything," Torvald said gently. "We're simply reading what is written in the ancient symbols. The runes speak of a bloodline thought lost, of a child of the Seer's Circle who survived when all others perished." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside, 3 people sat suspended in a moment that would change everything. Jorund's hand closed around his grandfather's amulet, and for the first time in 15 years, He wondered if the old man might have been more than just the simple hunter he had claimed to be. The questions he had never thought to ask began forming in his mind, along with a terrible suspicion that his carefully constructed solitude was about to be shattered forever. The old couple exchanged a look heavy with shared knowledge, and Jorund realized that their meeting in the storm had been no accident. Somehow, they had been seeking him, guided by forces he did not understand, toward a confrontation with truths he was not sure he wanted to face. The fever took Ira during the darkest hour before dawn. Jorund woke to Torvald's urgent whispers and found the old woman burning with heat despite the furs piled around her. Her breathing came in short, desperate gasps, and when he touched her forehead, it felt like touching heated stone. The hypothermia had given way to something worse. Her body's desperate attempt to restore warmth had triggered a fever that threatened to consume her from within. "She's dying," Torvald said, his voice breaking with grief and terror. "After everything we've survived, I'm going to lose her to this cursed mountain." Jorund had seen such fevers before. Sometimes the body's recovery from severe cold became its own enemy, the warming process triggering reactions that could kill as surely as the freeze itself. He moved quickly, gathering the strongest herbs from his stores, fever few to break the temperature, willow bark for the pain, and precious ginseng root he had traded for years ago. As he prepared the healing draught, Ara began to speak in her delirium, but these were not the random mutterings of a fevered mind. Her words carried the cadence of prophecy, spoken in the old tongue that Jorund recognized, but could not fully understand. "The blood of kings flows in forgotten veins," she whispered, her sightless gaze fixed on the cabin's rafters. "The wolf's son walks among us, marked by his grandfather's gift, bearing the weight of a crown he does not know he wears." Torvald leaned forward, his face pale with recognition. "She speaks the words from the Chronicle," he breathed, "the prophecy we thought lost." "What Chronicle?" Jorund demanded, forcing the herbal mixture between Era's parched lips. Torvald hesitated, then reached into his pack with reverent care. From its depths, he withdrew an object wrapped in oiled leather, a book bound in ancient hide, its pages yellow with age. The cover bore symbols that matched those on the rune stones, but these were more elaborate, speaking of power and authority, rather than simple divination. "The Seer's Chronicle," Torvald said, unwrapping it slowly. "The record of bloodlines and prophecies maintained by the Circle for 1,000 years. We saved it when our community cast us out, knowing it would die with us if we left it behind." The book fell open as if by its own will, revealing pages covered in careful script interspersed with detailed genealogical charts. Torvald's finger traced the lines until he found what he sought, a family tree that branched and twisted like the roots of an ancient oak. "Here," he said, pointing to a name near the bottom of the page. "Bjorn the Wise, last true leader of the Seer's Circle. Killed defending the sacred grove from those who would destroy our knowledge. His wife, Astrid the Farseer, died beside him." The finger moved to a smaller notation. One child survived, a boy of 7 winters, spirited away by his grandfather before the massacre. Jorund felt the world tilting beneath him. The name on the page swam before his eyes, and suddenly he was 7 years old again, hiding in a root cellar while screams echoed above and smoke filled the air. His grandfather's weathered hands covering his mouth, whispering urgently, "Stay silent, boy. Stay hidden until the wolves have gone." "No," Jorund said, backing away from the book. "My grandfather was a hunter. We lived alone because that was his choice, not because—" He stopped, the protest dying on his lips as memory after memory crashed over him. His grandfather teaching him to read not just runes, but ancient scripts that no simple hunter should have known. The way the old man had flinched whenever they encountered other people, as if expecting recognition that never came. The careful way he had avoided settlements and trade routes, keeping to the deepest wilderness where questions were never asked. Most damning of all, the amulet around his neck, Not just any wolf's tooth, but carved with the same symbols that adorn the Chronicles' pages. A mark of nobility, of belonging to something far greater than a hermit's lonely existence. Your grandfather saved you, Torvald continued gently, but at great cost. He had to watch his son, your father, die defending ideals that the world no longer valued. He raised you in isolation to keep you safe from those who would finish what they had started. Era's fever suddenly broke, her body relaxing as if a great tension had been released. Her eyes opened, clear and focused for the first time since her collapse. When she looked at Jorund, it was with the recognition of someone seeing a long-lost relative. "You have your father's eyes," she said softly, "and your mother's stubborn chin. I held you when you were born, little prince. I taught you your first words in the old tongue." The endearment hit Jorund like a physical blow. Little prince. He remembered that voice now, distant as a half-remembered dream, speaking those words with warmth and affection. The memories came flooding back. Not of a hermit's cabin, but of a great hall where children learned at the feet of wise elders, where knowledge was treasured above gold and wisdom valued above strength. "Why tell me this now?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Why, after all these years of silence?" Torvald and Era exchanged a look heavy with shared sorrow. It was she who answered, her voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "Because the Seer's circle is not dead," she said. "Parts of it survive, scattered and hidden, waiting for the bloodline to return. But they are being hunted, picked off one by those who fear what we represent." "Our own exile was not random," Torvald added. "We were forced out because someone learned of our connection to the old ways. They hoped we would die quietly in the wilderness, taking our secrets with us. But the runes guided us to you, as they were meant to." Jorund's mind reeled with the implications. "You're saying there are others? Other survivors of the circle?" "Perhaps a dozen families scattered across the northern kingdoms," Era confirmed. "Each one guarding a piece of the greater knowledge, waiting for the day when it could be reunited under proper leadership." She reached for something at her throat, a silver ring hanging from a thin chain, so tarnished that Jorund had not noticed it before. With trembling fingers, she lifted it over her head and held it out to him. The ring bore the seal of leadership, a wolf surrounded by runes of protection and wisdom. Torvald's ring, when he revealed it, showed the double-headed raven of the circle's guardians. Together, they represented an authority that Jorund had never imagined existed, let alone inherited. "We cannot force you to accept what you are," Torvald said. "Your grandfather made his choice to keep you hidden, and perhaps he was right to do so. But the world is changing, and the old wisdom may be needed now more than ever." "What do you mean?" Jorund asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. "The ones who destroyed the circle 28 years ago, they're still out there," Era explained. "Still hunting anyone connected to the old ways. They call themselves the Iron Wolves, and they believe that the past should stay buried, that tradition and wisdom are obstacles to progress." The name struck a chord of ancient fear in Jorund's heart. Iron Wolves. His grandfather had spoken of them in whispers, describing them as men who had sold their souls for power and would stop at nothing to erase any challenge to their vision of the world. "They know about you now," Torvald said quietly. "Our exile was not as subtle as they intended. There are those among our former people who remember the old stories, who can add 2 and 2 together. If we could find you using the runes, so can they." As if summoned by his words, Skarr suddenly rose from his place by the fire, a low growl rumbling in his throat. The wolf's hackles were raised, his attention focused on the cabin door. Outside, the storm had finally begun to abate, but the sudden silence felt ominous rather than peaceful. Jorund moved to the window, peering through a gap in the wooden shutters. In the grey light of early dawn, he could see tracks in the snow, too many tracks for the handful of travelers who might legitimately use these paths. The marks were purposeful, organized, speaking of a group moving with military precision rather than the wandering of lost wanderers. "How many knew where you were going when you left?" he asked urgently. "Too many," Torvald admitted. The runes were not subtle in their guidance. Anyone with knowledge of the old ways could have followed the same signs that led us here. Jorund felt the weight of his inherited destiny settling on his shoulders, like a mantle made of stone. For 15 years, he had lived in peaceful isolation, answerable to no one, responsible only for his own survival. Now, in the space of a single night, he had been thrust into a legacy of blood and obligation that stretched back 1,000 years. The tracks in the snow told their own story. The hunters had found their prey, and the last remnants of the Seer's circle were trapped in a cabin on a mountain peak with nowhere to run and no allies to call upon. Outside, Skarr's growl deepened, and Jorund realized that his old life was ending whether he wanted it to or not. The only question now was whether he would face what came next as a hermit who happened to share royal blood, or as the rightful heir to a tradition worth dying to preserve. The healing took 3 days, and in that time, the world outside the cabin transformed from enemy to sanctuary and back again. Eira's recovery came slowly, marked by long conversations by the firelight and the gradual return of color to her cheeks. As her strength returned, so did her memory, and with it came stories that painted Jorund's childhood in colors he had never imagined. "You were such a serious child," she told him on the second evening, her eyes bright with remembered affection. "Always asking questions about traditions and ceremonies. Your parents worried you would grow up to be a scholar rather than a leader." Jorund found himself hungry for these fragments of a past he had never known existed. Each story felt like finding a missing piece of himself, but with every revelation came a growing weight of responsibility he had never asked for. "Tell me about the Chronicle," he said, watching as Torvald carefully tended the ancient book. "Your father entrusted it to me during the attack," Torvald replied gravely. "It contains more than genealogies, prophecies and rituals that guided our people for generations." "Here," Eira said, pointing to a passage written in ancient script, "the prophecy that guided us to you. When the circle breaks and wisdom scatters, look for the wolf son in the high places. He who walks alone but was born to unite shall gather the scattered stones and forge them new." Jorund's hand moved to his amulet. The wolf tooth felt warm against his palm, and now he understood its significance, not just a hunter's trophy, but a mark of nobility. "The scattered stones," he said slowly. "The other survivors you mentioned." 12 families confirmed. Torvald nodded. "Perhaps more hidden so deep they cannot be found even by the runes. Each one guards a fragment of the greater knowledge. Healing arts, weatherworking, the deep wisdom of bloodlines and destiny. Separately, they are wise individuals. Together, under proper leadership, they could restore the circle to something approaching its former glory." But even as they spoke of restoration and unity, danger grew more real with each passing hour. Skarr had taken to patrolling the cabin's perimeter, his behavior growing more agitated. The tracks Jorund had seen were joined by others, suggesting a coordinated search. "They know we're here," Jorund said on the 3rd morning, studying fresh sign in the snow outside. "Whatever stealth you had is gone." "Perhaps that was inevitable," Eira replied with a calmness that surprised him. "The runes spoke of a convergence, not a hiding. Events are moving toward some resolution whether we will it or not." Her words proved prophetic that afternoon. Jorund was checking his trap lines when he encountered their first hunter, a lean man in iron-gray furs moving through the forest with practiced stealth. When he spotted Jorund, there was immediate recognition in his gaze. "You're him," the man said, his hand moving to his sword hilt. "The lost son. You look just like your father." "I don't know what you're talking about," Jorund replied, though the lie felt hollow even to his own ears. "The old woman and her husband, they led us right to you, just as we hoped they would. Clever of us to let them think they were escaping when really they were following the path we wanted them to take. The revelation hit Jorund like a blow to the chest. Ira and Torvald hadn't found him by chance or even by the rune's guidance. They had been herded here, manipulated into leading their enemies directly to the last heir of the Seer's circle. "You used them," he said, anger building in his voice. "We used their love for the old ways against them," the man confirmed. "Just as we'll use your misplaced sense of honor. Surrender now, and we might let the old couple die quickly." The fight that followed was brief but brutal. Jorund's years of solitary survival had kept his reflexes sharp, and the stranger had underestimated what 15 years in the wilderness could teach a man about violence. When it was over, the hunter lay still in the snow, but his death had bought them time, not safety. Jorund raced back to the cabin, finding Ira and Torvald preparing for departure with the grim efficiency of people who had faced such moments before. "How many more?" he demanded. "At least a dozen," Torvald replied, securing the Chronicle in its oiled wrappings. "Perhaps twice that. The Iron Wolves take no chances when hunting the bloodline." "Why didn't you tell me?" Jorund's anger burned hot and bright. "Why didn't you warn me that I was the bait in their trap?" Era stopped her packing and looked at him with eyes full of sorrow and understanding. "Because if we had, would you have chosen to face what's coming? Would you have accepted your inheritance knowing it meant almost certain death?" Her words struck home because they carried the weight of truth. 3 days ago, Jorund would have fled deeper into the mountains, abandoning these strangers to save his own life. The revelation of his heritage, the slow rebuilding of trust and connection, it had all been necessary to transform him from hermit to heir. Besides, Torvald added with grim humor, "The runes don't lie, only reveal truth in their own time. We were always meant to find you, and this confrontation was always meant to happen. The only question is whether we face it as victims or as the inheritors of 1,000 years of wisdom." Outside, Skarr's warning howl echoed off the mountain peaks. More hunters were approaching, and their window for escape was closing rapidly. Jorund felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. He could still run, still disappear into the deep wilderness where even the Iron Wolves couldn't follow. Or he could stand and fight for a legacy he barely understood, protecting 2 elderly strangers who had inadvertently brought death to his doorstep. He looked at the Chronicle, its ancient pages containing the stories of generations who had made similar choices. Each name in those genealogies represented someone who had chosen duty over safety, wisdom over survival. The wolf-tooth amulet grew warm against his chest, and for a moment he could almost hear his grandfather's voice. "A man is measured not by how long he lives, boy, but by what he's willing to die for." "There's another way off this mountain," Jorund said finally. "Paths the hunters won't know, but it means leaving everything behind." "Everything?" Ira asked. Jorund looked around the cabin that had been his world for so many years, the hand-built furniture, the carefully gathered supplies, the sanctuary he had created from nothing. Then he looked at the Chronicle, in the hope in the old couple's eyes. "Everything I was," he corrected. "But maybe that's what needs to happen." As they prepared for a flight that would either lead to freedom or death, Jorund realized that his transformation had already begun. The hermit who had saved 2 strangers from a storm no longer existed. In his place stood someone he didn't yet fully understand, the last heir to a broken circle, carrying the weight of his ancestors' dreams and the hope of a scattered people. The hunters were closing in, but for the first time in 15 years, Jorund wasn't running alone. The escape from the cabin came at dawn, when mist still clung to the mountainside, and the world existed in shades of gray. Jorund led them along paths that existed more in memory than reality. Game trails worn smooth by generations of deer and elk, ledges barely wide enough for a man's foot, passages through stands of pine so thick they blocked out the sky. Behind them, smoke rose from the direction of his former home. The Iron Wolves had found the cabin empty and vented their frustration on 15 years of careful construction. Jorund felt each wisp of smoke like a personal blow, but he pushed the grief aside. The hermit's life was over. What mattered now was keeping his companions alive long enough to understand what came next. They traveled in silence, communication reduced to hand signals and careful footsteps. Ira moved with surprising grace for her age, her recovery from near death more complete than Jorund would have thought possible. Torvald bore the chronicle wrapped against his chest, treating the ancient book like a living thing that needed protection from the mountain cold. It was Skarr who found the cave, a narrow opening hidden behind a curtain of ice-heavy pine boughs, leading to chambers that stretched back into the mountain's heart. The wolf's behavior suggested safety, and Jorund had learned to trust his companion's instincts above his own rational assessment. Inside, the cave system proved more extensive than any of them had hoped. Natural chambers connected by passages worn smooth by underground streams, with evidence that someone had used this place long before their arrival. Ancient fire-blackened stones marked old hearths, and carved symbols on the walls spoke of occupation by people who understood the old ways. "A sanctuary," Era breathed, running her fingers over runes cut deep into the living rock. Built by the Circle in the early days, when persecution first drove them from the settlements. It was in this hidden refuge that Jorund's world broke apart completely. While searching the deepest chamber for additional exits, his hands found something tucked into a natural shelf in the stone wall. At first touch, he thought it was just another loose rock. But when he pulled it free, firelight revealed a shape that made his heart stop. A piece of metal, curved and blackened with age, bearing symbols that matched his grandfather's amulet. "What have you found?" Torvald asked, seeing the sudden change in Jorund's expression. With trembling hands, Jorund held up the fragment. Even damaged and incomplete, its significance was unmistakable. Part of a shield boss, decorated with the wolf head symbol of his family line. But this wasn't just any shield. The metalwork was too fine, the symbols too elaborate for anything but the weapon of a leader. "It's his," Jorund whispered, though speaking the words made them real in a way he wasn't prepared to handle. "My father's shield." The discovery triggered a flood of memories that his mind had kept locked away for decades. Not the fragmented impressions of early childhood, but clear, vivid scenes that played out with devastating clarity. His father, tall and golden-bearded, raising this very shield against attackers who poured through the great hall's doors like a tide of iron and blood. His mother's voice, urgent and desperate, as she pressed something small and precious into his 7-year-old hands. The wolf-tooth amulet that now hung around his neck. His grandfather's weathered face, streaked with tears as he carried a terrified boy away from the only home he had ever known. "They said everyone died," Jorund said, his voice breaking. "My grandfather told me everyone died." Era moved to his side, her presence a steady anchor as his world rearranged itself around truths too painful to bear. "Not everyone. Your father fought to the end, giving others time to escape. Your mother held the great door until the flames reached her. They died so that you might live. And you?" Jorund turned to face his elderly companions, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "You were there. You saw it happen." Torvald's face aged 10 years in as many seconds. "We were young then, barely past our apprentice years in the Circle. When the attack began, your father ordered us to save what we could and run. We wanted to fight, to stand with our leaders, but he made you choose between honor and duty," Era finished quietly. "Save the Chronicle or die uselessly in a battle already lost. We chose duty, though it felt like cowardice then." The cave fell silent except for the distant drip of melting ice and the soft sound of Skarr's breathing. Jorund held the shield fragment in both hands, feeling the weight of its history and the terrible responsibility it represented. "You've carried this guilt for 28 years, he said, understanding at last why they had sought him out, why they had risked everything to find the scattered heir of a broken kingdom. "Every day," Torvald confirmed, "knowing we lived when better people died, preserving knowledge that seemed increasingly meaningless as the world moved on without us." Jorund looked at the chronicle, then at the runes carved into the cave walls, finally at the shield fragment that connected him to a father he barely remembered, and a mother whose sacrifice he was only now beginning to understand. "Tell me about them," he said finally. "Not the legend or the prophecy. Tell me about who they were." And in that hidden sanctuary, while hunters searched the mountain above and wind howled through passages carved by ancient hands, Ira and Torvald painted him a picture of the parents he had lost. His father, Bjorn the Wise, who could settle disputes with words where others required swords. His mother, Astrid the Farseer, whose gift with the runes was so profound that chiefs would travel for weeks seeking her counsel. But more than their skills or their leadership, they spoke of smaller things. How his father would carve wooden animals for the settlement's children, how his mother would hum ancient melodies while working in her garden, how they had loved each other with the quiet intensity of two souls perfectly matched. "They were your age when they died," Era said gently. "Young people trying to preserve something precious in a world that was forgetting why it mattered." The parallel wasn't lost on Jorund. Here he sat, the same age his parents had been when they made their final stand, faced with the same choice between safety and responsibility that had defined their lives and death. Outside the cave, night was falling, and with it came the sounds of their pursuers, distant voices calling to each other through the forest, the occasional gleam of torchlight through the trees. The Iron Wolves were methodical in their search, and it was only a matter of time before they found this sanctuary. Jorund wrapped the shield fragment carefully and tucked it into his pack alongside the wolf tooth amulet. 2 pieces of his inheritance, material links to people who had shaped his existence even in their absence. "We can't stay here," he said, though every instinct urged him to remain in this place where his parents' presence still felt tangible. "No," Torvald agreed, "but now you understand what we're really fighting for, not just the preservation of old knowledge, but the memory of good people who died believing their sacrifice meant something." As they prepared to leave the sanctuary, Jorund realized that his transformation was accelerating beyond his control. The hermit who had lived only for his own survival was disappearing, replaced by someone who carried the hopes and dreams of generations on his shoulders. The burden should have crushed him. Instead, for the first time since childhood, he felt like he was becoming who he was always meant to be. They left the sanctuary before dawn, following paths revealed by the sacred map of hidden passages that Torvald had produced from the Chronicles, protective wrappings. The ancient parchment, drawn in inks that seemed to shift and change in the firelight, showed routes through the mountains that no living person should have known. Secret ways used by the Circle in times of persecution, marked with symbols that spoke of safe passage and hidden allies. The map led them higher into the peaks, through terrain so treacherous that even Jorund's mountain-bred skills were tested. Ice-slick ledges barely wide enough for a single file, passages through snow-filled gorges where one wrong step meant a fall measured in hundreds of feet, and always the constant awareness that their pursuers were closing the distance with each hour that passed. It was on the second day of flight that they first saw their enemy clearly. Jorund had climbed a rocky outcrop to scout their back trail when movement in the valley below caught his attention. Through gaps in the forest canopy, he glimpsed them, a column of men moving with military precision, their iron-gray cloaks marking them as servants of those who had destroyed his family. At their head rode a figure that made Jorund's blood run cold, not because he recognized the man, but because of the aura of casual cruelty that seemed to radiate from him even at this distance. Grim Ironhand, the map had called him, leader of the Iron Wolves and architect of the Circle's destruction. Even from afar, his presence commanded attention. Tall in his saddle, moving with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat, directing his followers with gestures that spoke of absolute authority. "How many?" Torvald asked when Jorund returned to their hiding place among the rocks. 20, perhaps more, well armed and moving fast. Jorund consulted the sacred map, tracing possible routes with his finger. "They're following our trail perfectly, as if they know these paths as well as we do." "That's impossible," Era said, but her voice carried doubt. "These routes were known only to Circle members, and all of them are dead." "All except us," Torvald corrected grimly, "and whoever betrayed your parents all those years ago." The implications hung heavy in the mountain air. Someone within the Circle had provided the information that made the massacre possible. Someone who had known the defenses, the escape routes, the sacred places where knowledge was hidden. That betrayal had cost dozens of lives and scattered the survivors to the winds. Now, 28 years later, that same treachery was hunting them through passages that should have been secret. "We need to reach the northern sanctuary," Era said, pointing to a symbol on the map that looked like a tree growing from a mountain peak. "If any of the other bloodlines survived, that's where they'll be gathered. It's the traditional place of convergence when the Circle is threatened." "How far?" Jorund asked, though he could already see the answer in the map's intricate markings. 3 days, if we push hard and the weather holds." Torvald's expression was grim. "But we'll be traveling through the most exposed terrain in the entire range. If they catch us in the open, they won't catch us," Jorund interrupted, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Not if we're smart about it." Over the next hours, as they moved through terrain that tested every survival skill he possessed, Jorund found himself drawing on knowledge he didn't remember learning. How to read the mountain's moods in the color of the sky, where to find shelter in seemingly barren landscapes, which paths would muffle sound and which would carry it for miles. Skills that went beyond simple woodcraft into something approaching intuitive understanding. Era noticed first. "You move like someone who was born to these heights," she observed as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of broken scree. "Your grandfather taught you well." "This isn't something he taught me," Jorund replied, pausing to help her over a gap in the rocks. "It feels like remembering something I always knew." "The blood awakening," Torvald said with satisfaction. "Your heritage asserting itself now that you've accepted what you are." The Circle's leaders were chosen as much for their connection to the land as for their wisdom with people. That evening, huddled in a shelter carved from wind-sculpted stone, they encountered their first real test of Jorund's emerging abilities. Skarr had been growing increasingly restless as the day progressed, his hackles rising at scents and sounds that seemed to trouble only him. When full darkness fell, his agitation reached a peak that had him pacing the shelter's perimeter with barely contained aggression. "They're close," Jorund said, reading his companion's behavior with the fluency of long partnership. "Close enough that he can smell them." "Impossible," Era protested. "We've been climbing all day. They can't have matched our pace through this terrain." But even as she spoke, the distant sound of voices drifted up from the valley below, too far to make out words, but close enough to confirm that their pursuers had indeed closed much of the gap. "They're not following our trail," Jorund realized, studying the sacred map by the light of a carefully shielded fire. "They're anticipating where we're going. Someone's told them about the northern sanctuary." The revelation forced a terrible choice upon them. Continue toward the traditional gathering place and risk walking into a trap, or abandon their planned route and strike out into unknown territory where other Circle survivors would never find them. "There's a third option," Torvald said quietly, his finger tracing an alternate route on the ancient parchment. "The Widow's Path." Even Ira blanched at the name. "That route hasn't been used in generations. The risks are less than the certainty of capture if we continue as planned." Torvald's voice carried the weight of hard experience. Your father used the widow's path during the last great persecution when conventional routes were compromised. It cost him half his party, but those who survived reached safety. The widow's path, according to the map's cryptic notations, wound through terrain so dangerous that it was considered a last resort even in desperate times. Avalanche zones that could be triggered by a careless footstep, crevasses hidden by snow bridges that might support a man's weight or might collapse without warning, and weather patterns so unpredictable that clear skies could become killing storms within hours. If we take that route, there's no turning back, Jorund said, studying the intricate warnings marked along the path. One mistake, and we all die. And if we continue toward the sanctuary, we die certainly rather than possibly, Era replied with the grim logic of someone who had faced such choices before. The decision, when it came, felt as inevitable as sunrise. They would take the widow's path, trading known danger for unknown risk in the hope of preserving something more valuable than their individual lives. As they prepared to abandon their shelter and strike out into the most treacherous terrain in the known world, Jorund felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders like his grandfather's old cloak. These people were trusting him with their lives, believing that his awakening heritage would be enough to see them through trials that had killed experienced mountaineers. Below them, torchlight flickered through the trees as their hunters drew ever closer. Above them, the widow's path wound into darkness, promising either salvation or death with equal likelihood. For the first time since childhood, Jorund found himself praying to gods he wasn't sure existed, asking for strength not just to survive what was coming, but to be worthy of the trust placed in him by two brave people who had already sacrificed everything for the chance to see their world made whole again. The widow's path earned its name within the first hour of climbing. They moved in darkness, trusting their lives to handholds carved by ice and time, following a route that existed more as suggestion than reality. The ancient map marked it clearly enough, but translating symbols drawn centuries ago into safe passage through terrain that shifted with every season proved nearly impossible. Twice, Jorund had to backtrack when paths simply ended in sheer drops or walls of ice too thick to penetrate. It was during their first rest, huddled on a ledge barely wide enough for 3 people, that Era produced the crystal that would change everything. "I should have shown you this sooner," she said, unwrapping a cloth bundle with reverent care. From within emerged a stone unlike anything Jorund had ever seen, clear as winter ice but shot through with veins of light that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. "Ira's healing crystal, passed down through my family for 7 generations. The moment the crystal caught the moonlight, Jorund felt something shift in the air around them. Not just the usual mountain cold, but a presence, ancient and watchful, as if they had suddenly gained the attention of forces far beyond human understanding. "What does it do?" he asked, though part of him already sensed the answer. "It shows truth," Era replied simply. "Not just what is, but what could be. The consequences of choices, the paths that branch from this moment into all possible futures." She held the crystal up to the pale starlight, and its inner illumination grew stronger, casting patterns on the rock wall behind them that seemed to move independently of the stone's position. Shadows danced and shifted, forming shapes that almost made sense before dissolving into new configurations. "Show us," she whispered to the crystal. "Show us what happens if the circle's knowledge dies with us." The vision that followed struck them with the force of physical blows. They saw cities burning, not from war, but from ignorance. Plagues that could have been prevented with preserved healing knowledge sweeping through populations like wildfire. They saw communities tearing themselves apart over disputes that the circle's mediation traditions could have resolved peacefully. Most devastating of all, they saw the slow death of wisdom itself as practical knowledge became mere superstition, and the careful balance between human needs and natural law crumbled into exploitation and waste. "How long?" Jorund managed to ask, when the images finally faded. 2 generations, Era replied, her voice hollow with the weight of prophecy. Maybe 3 if we're fortunate. But without the circle's guidance, the northern kingdoms will forget everything that made them strong. The crystal's light dimmed but didn't disappear entirely, maintaining a soft glow that seemed to respond to their emotional state. When Jorund touched its surface, warmth spread through his fingers, and for a moment he felt connected to something vast and patient, the accumulated wisdom of centuries condensed into crystalline form. "There's more," Torvald said quietly. "Show him the rest." Ira hesitated, then raised the crystal again. This time, the visions that emerged were personal, intimate in a way that made Jorund want to look away, but couldn't. He saw himself as he could become. Standing in a great hall filled with people who looked to him for guidance, the wolf tooth amulet replaced by a crown that seemed to be made of living light. He saw communities flourishing under the restored circle's protection, knowledge flowing between settlements like water finding its proper course. He saw Skarr grown old and grey, still at his side, but now accompanied by children who learned the old ways with the same reverence their ancestors had shown. But alongside these images of hope came darker possibilities, himself dead in the snow of this very mountain. The Chronicle, burned to ashes in grim iron hands, triumphant hands, the scattered survivors of the circle, hunted down one by one until not even memory remained of what they had once represented. "The future is not fixed," Era explained as the visions faded. "These are possibilities, paths that branch from the choices we make in the hours and days to come. But the crystal doesn't lie about consequences. If we fail here, if the knowledge dies with us, the darkness it showed us will become reality." They resumed climbing as dawn painted the peaks in shades of rose and gold, but the weight of what they had seen traveled with them. Each step forward carried the burden of responsibility for generations yet unborn, each choice made with the awareness that failure meant more than just their own deaths. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous as they climbed higher. The widow's path lived up to its fearsome reputation, presenting them with obstacles that would have turned back experienced mountaineers. Ice-covered rock faces that required them to cut handholds with their daggers, snow bridges over crevasses so deep that dropped stones made no sound when they hit bottom, and always the awareness that one mistake would mean death not just for themselves, but for everything they represented. It was Skarr who first sensed the change in their pursuers' behavior. The wolf's agitation had been growing throughout the morning, but as they paused for a brief rest on a wind-scoured plateau, his behavior shifted from anxiety to something approaching panic. "They're not just following anymore," Jorund realized, reading his companion's body language with practiced ease. "They're hurting us." The truth became clear as they studied their back trail. The Iron Wolves had split their force, using the main group to drive their quarry forward while smaller parties moved to block alternate routes. It was a hunting technique as old as mankind itself. Pressure from behind combined with barriers ahead, forcing prey into a killing ground of the hunter's choosing. "How much farther to the next waypoint?" Jorund asked, consulting the sacred map with growing urgency. "Half a day," Torvald replied, but his voice carried doubt. "If the route hasn't changed since this was drawn." They pushed harder now, abandoning caution for speed as the trap closed around them. The crystal in Era's pack pulsed with increasing frequency, responding to some danger that hadn't yet revealed itself. When she finally brought it out to check their path, its light was so brilliant that it hurt to look at directly. "Something's wrong," she said, studying the patterns of illumination dancing through the stone. "The crystal shows convergence ahead, not just our paths meeting with our hunters, but something else, something that was waiting for us to arrive." The revelation that their flight might be leading them into a prepared ambush rather than towards safety struck them like a physical blow. But retreat was no longer possible. The Iron Wolves were too close, the terrain too exposed to offer alternative routes. As they crested the final ridge before the waypoint, Jorund felt destiny closing around them like the jaws of a trap. Whatever waited ahead, whatever choices the crystal had shown them, the moment of decision was almost upon them. The weight of his inheritance had never felt heavier, but for the first time since accepting it, he was ready to bear that burden rather than flee from it. The ambush was perfect, too perfect for Jorund's growing unease. They found them waiting at the waypoint as the crystal had foretold, iron wolves positioned with military precision around the ancient stone circle that marked one of the circle's most sacred sites. 20 men in battle array, weapons drawn, forming a barrier that sealed off every escape route except the way they had come. At their head stood grim Ironhand, and seeing him clearly for the first time, Jorund felt the world shift beneath his feet like ice cracking over deep water. The man was older than expected, perhaps 40 winters, with premature silver threading through dark hair and scars that spoke of countless battles survived. But it wasn't his age or his bearing that struck Jorund like a physical blow. It was the terrible familiarity of his features. The shape of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the way he held his head when listening to subordinates' report. Jorund had seen that same posture in mirrors, in the surface of still water, in the brief glimpses of his own reflection that mountain life occasionally provided. "Hello, little brother," Grim said, his voice carrying warmth that made the words even more devastating. "You've led us quite a chase." The greeting hung in the mountain air like the echo of an avalanche, reshaping everything Jorund thought he knew about himself, his past, and the hunt that had driven them to this moment. "That's impossible," Era breathed, but her voice carried the hollow ring of someone stating a truth they desperately wanted to deny. Grim smiled, the expression transforming his scarred features into something almost gentle. "Is it? Look at him, old woman. Look past the hermit's beard and the mountain tan. Look at the bone structure, the way he moves, the eyes that see too much. Did you really think the bloodline would only produce one heir?" Jorund's mind raced back through fragmentary childhood memories, searching for any trace of the brother he had apparently lost, along with everything else. Flashes came, a playmate slightly older than himself, someone who had shared lessons and adventures in a life that felt more like stories than actual memory. A boy with dark hair and quick laughter who had always been stronger, faster, more confident than Jorund himself. "Grim was your closest companion before the attack," Torvald confirmed reluctantly. "Your father's eldest son, heir to the Circle's leadership until—" He stopped, clearly, struggling with revelations he had hoped never to make. "Until I was corrupted," Grim finished matter-of-factly. "Until I chose power over wisdom, strength over compassion, certainty over the endless doubts that paralyzed our father." From beneath his iron-gray cloak, Grim drew a weapon that made the assembled circle members recoil as if from physical contamination. The blade was magnificent and terrible, steel so dark it seemed to drink light, inscribed with runes that hurt to look at directly, radiating a malevolence that was almost tangible. "Grim's blood-oath blade," Era whispered, recognition and horror warring in her voice. "The cursed sword that binds its wielder to hunt down every member of the Seer's Circle until none remain," Grim completed, hefting the weapon with casual familiarity. "To ensure that the old ways die completely, making room for a world built on strength rather than sentiment." The blade's dark runes pulsed with their own rhythm, and Jorund could feel its influence even from a distance, a pressure against his thoughts, urging him toward despair and surrender. This was more than just a weapon. It was an instrument of spiritual warfare, designed to corrupt everything it touched. "You chose to bind yourself to that thing?" Jorund asked, unable to keep the anguish from his voice. For a moment, Grim's expression flickered, and something almost human showed through the confident facade. "Chose? Oh, little brother, you understand so little about the forces that shape our world. The blade chose me, just as surely as your grandfather's amulet chose you." The difference is that I was strong enough to accept what I was offered. But even as he spoke, Jorund noticed something that gave him hope. The hand holding the cursed blade trembled almost imperceptibly, and when Grim's gaze met his, there was something pleading in the depths of those familiar eyes. This wasn't just corruption, it was possession, a battle for control of a soul that hadn't surrendered completely despite decades of dark influence. "The curse feeds on hatred," Era explained urgently, her healer's instincts recognizing what Jorund had seen. "But it requires the host's willing participation to maintain full control. If even a fragment of the original person remains—" "Silence," Grim commanded, but his voice lacked the absolute authority it had carried moments before. The blade's runes flared brighter, reasserting their hold, but the crack in the armor had been revealed. "You remember," Jorund said, stepping forward despite the weapons arrayed against him. "Somewhere under that curse, you remember who we used to be." "I remember everything," Grim replied, and now the pain in his voice was unmistakable. "I remember a naive boy who believed that wisdom could triumph over force, that tradition mattered more than survival. I remember watching that boy's ideals burn along with everyone he loved. And I remember teaching you to carve wood animals," Jorund continued, more fragments of memory surfacing as the connection between them strengthened. "I remember you protecting me from older children who thought I was too serious, too studious. I remember—" "Stop." The word came out as a roar, but tears were streaming down Grim's face now, cutting tracks through years of accumulated guilt and rage. "You don't understand what you're asking. The blade doesn't just corrupt, it demands payment. Every moment I resist its will, every second I remember what I once was. Someone dies. My own men, innocent travelers, anyone within reach when the hunger becomes too strong." The confession revealed the true scope of Grim's torment. He wasn't just a willing servant of dark forces. He was a prisoner in his own body, forced to watch as the curse used his hands to destroy everything he had once held sacred. "Then let us help you break it," Era said, producing her crystal from its protective wrapping. "The healing arts include more than just physical ailments. Curses can be undone if the will to resist is strong enough." "Impossible," one of Grim's lieutenants protested. "The blood oath cannot be broken once sworn." But even as he spoke, the cursed blade began to smoke in Grim's grip, its dark runes writhing like living things in response to the crystal's proximity. Whatever forces had bound the weapon to its wielder, they recognized a threat in the ancient healing stone. "It would require willing sacrifice," Torvald said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. Someone of the bloodline would have to take on part of the curse's burden, sharing the spiritual weight until it could be dispersed. The offer hung in the air between the brothers. Salvation that might cost Jorund everything he had only recently discovered about himself. But looking at Grim's tortured features, seeing the man his brother had become and the boy he might be again, the choice felt as inevitable as sunrise. "The circle was founded on sacrifice," Jorund said, reaching for his grandfather's amulet. "Our parents died to preserve something greater than themselves. If their sons can't find the courage to do the same—" "No," Grim whispered, but the word carried desperate hope rather than refusal. "You don't know what you're offering. The hunger, the endless need to destroy. If the ritual fails, you'll become what I am. Another servant of darkness, another weapon pointed at everything pure in the world." "Then we'll make sure it doesn't fail," Jorund replied with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "You're not alone anymore, brother. None of us are." The cursed blade shrieked as Ira stepped forward with her crystal raised, its dark light warring with the healing stone's radiance. Around them, the iron wolves began to waver as their leader's internal struggle became visible, some stepping back in confusion, while others raised weapons against threats they couldn't understand. The final confrontation was beginning, but it wouldn't be the battle any of them had expected. Instead of sword against sword, it would be soul against soul, love against corruption, the bonds of family against the chains of ancient darkness. And somewhere in the balance hung not just their lives, but the future of everything the Seer's Circle had ever represented. The ancient waypoint became a battlefield of wills rather than weapons, but the tension was no less deadly for its spiritual nature. Era's crystal blazed with increasing intensity as she began the ritual of unbinding, its light revealing truths that had been hidden for decades. The runes carved into the sacred stones around them responded to its presence, glowing with the same soft radiance that had once marked this place as a sanctuary for those seeking wisdom. But the cursed blade fought back with equal fervor, its dark influence spreading like poison through the mountain air. Several of Grimm's men staggered, clutching their heads as competing forces warred for control of their thoughts. The weapon's hunger was so strong that even hardened warriors began to question their purpose, their loyalty, their very sense of self. "The sacred fire," Torvald said urgently, pointing to a depression in the central stone that Jorund had mistaken for natural weathering. "This waypoint was built around one of the eternal flames. If we can light it." "The torch is still here," Ira interrupted, her voice carrying wonder despite the growing chaos around them. From a hidden alcove in the largest standing stone, she withdrew an object that made Goran's breath catch in his throat. The Circle's sacred fire torch was unlike anything he had imagined. Not the rough-hewn implement he had expected, but a work of art that spoke of master craftsmanship spanning generations. The handle was carved from wood so old it had taken on the hardness of stone, inscribed with genealogies that traced the bloodlines of every Circle leader back to the founding. The head was wrought silver, shaped like a wolf's mouth, opened in an eternal howl, designed to hold flame that would burn without consuming the fuel. "Only true Circle blood can light it," Era explained, even as the sounds of spiritual battle grew louder around them. "Your father lit it on the night you were born, declaring you heir to everything the Circle represented. If the bloodline still runs strong, it will work," Jorund said with certainty that surprised him. The torch felt warm in his hands, responding to his touch in ways that went beyond the physical. As his fingers found the proper grip, memories flooded back. Not his own, but ancestral knowledge flowing through the artifact like water through a broken dam. He could feel them. Generations of Circle leaders who had held this same torch, faced similar moments of crisis, made choices between safety and duty that echoed down through the centuries. Their wisdom whispered to him, offering guidance for challenges they could never have imagined but somehow understood in their deepest essence. But lighting the sacred fire was only the first step. As Ira's crystal revealed the true nature of the curse binding Grimm, the complexity of their task became clear. The blood oath was more than just spiritual corruption. It was a web of obligations and compulsions that had grown stronger with each life it claimed, each act of destruction it compelled. 28 years, Torvald said grimly, studying the curse's structure through the crystal's revealing light. 28 years of accumulated darkness, feeding on guilt and pain and the slow erosion of everything human in him. Breaking this will require more than just willing sacrifice. Grimm stood at the center of the conflict, his body racked with tremors as curse and conscience warred for control. The dark blade in his hands seemed to be fighting him now, trying to force movement that he resisted with every ounce of strength remaining to him. "Tell me what I need to do," Jorund said, approaching his brother despite the weapons still pointed at him from every direction. "Light the sacred fire first," Era instructed. "Its power will help anchor the ritual and provide protection from the curse's attempts to corrupt the process." The torch flared to life at Jorund's touch, its flame burning silver-white instead of the orange and red he had expected. The light it cast revealed details that had been hidden moments before. Additional runes carved into the sacred stones, patterns in the ancient stonework that suggested this place had been designed specifically for rituals of unbinding and redemption. "Now approach him," Torvald guided. The curse can only be broken by someone willing to share its burden, to take on part of the spiritual weight until it can be dispersed safely. But as Jorund moved closer to his brother, the true scope of what he was attempting became clear. The curse didn't just control Grim, it was part of him now, woven into his thoughts and memories and identity so thoroughly that removing it might destroy everything that remained of the man beneath. "You could lose yourself," Era warned, reading the same truth in her crystal's revelations. "The curse will try to claim you as well, to turn one servant into two. If your will wavers, if doubt creeps in, then I'll become another weapon pointed at everything good in the world," Jorund finished. "I understand the risks." Around them, the Iron Wolves were beginning to break ranks as their leader's struggle affected them all. Some threw down their weapons, crying out as decades of suppressed conscience suddenly reasserted itself. Others pressed forward with desperate violence, driven by the curse's need to preserve itself through any means necessary. Skarr positioned himself between the approaching warriors and the ritual's participants, the wolf's loyalty absolute even in the face of overwhelming odds. His fierce presence seemed to remind the attacking men of their own humanity. Several hesitated, unwilling to strike down an animal that was simply protecting its pack. "Brother," Jorund said softly, reaching out to touch Grim's shoulder despite the cursed blade trembling between them. "Look at me. See me. Not what the darkness wants you to see." For a moment, Grim's eyes cleared completely, revealing the boy Jorund remembered from fragmentary childhood memories. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything. When the blade first spoke to me, it promised power to protect what remained of our family. It said the Circle's way was too weak, too trusting. It convinced me that only strength could preserve what mattered." "And you believed it because you loved us," Jorund replied, understanding flooding through him. "The curse didn't corrupt you. It used your love against you, turned your desire to protect into a weapon of destruction." The sacred fire's flame grew brighter as the bond between brothers strengthened, its light beginning to penetrate the darkness that had surrounded Grim for so long. But the cursed blade fought back viciously, its runes blazing with malevolent fire as it tried to reassert control. "The sharing ritual," Torvald said urgently. "It has to be now, before the curse realizes what we're attempting." Jorund placed his free hand on the blade itself, feeling its corruption burn through his palm like acid. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but behind it came something unexpected. Relief from his brother as the curse's weight was suddenly distributed between two souls instead of crushing one. "I can feel it," Grim gasped, his voice more human than it had been in decades. "The hunger, the need to destroy, it's still there, but weaker, like a shout becoming a whisper." But the ritual was far from complete. As Jorund absorbed part of the curse's burden, he began to understand why it had been so effective at corrupting its victims. The darkness didn't just command obedience. It offered purpose to those who felt lost, certainty to those who doubted, and the terrible comfort of believing that destruction was sometimes necessary for creation. "Fight it," Era urged, seeing the struggle in Jorund's face. "Remember what you're fighting for, not just your brother's soul, but everyone who will suffer if the Circle's wisdom dies with us." The sacred fire's flame began to spread, running along the carved channels in the ancient stones like oil, following prepared paths. As it grew, its light revealed the true purpose of this waypoint. Not just a marker on ancient roads, but a place of power specifically designed for rituals of healing and redemption. Around the Circle's perimeter, other lights began to kindle, smaller flames emerging from hidden alcoves and carefully placed stones, creating a network of illumination that pushed back the curse's darkness step by step. "The ancestors," Torvald breathed, recognizing the pattern the Eod flames created. "They're here. All the Circle leaders who faced similar choices, offering their strength to complete what we've begun." Jorund could feel them, The presence of men and women who had carried the same burdens he now bore, who understood the weight of responsibility and the price of wisdom. Their voices whispered guidance through the sacred fire's flame, teaching him techniques for containing the curse's influence while preserving what remained of his brother's humanity. But even with ancestral support, the final stage of the ritual would require everything he had. Breaking the blood oath completely meant not just sharing its burden, but actively destroying the spiritual chains that had bound Grimm for so long. And the cursed blade, sensing its approaching dissolution, was preparing to make one final, desperate attempt to preserve itself by claiming both brothers for the darkness it served. The climax was coming, and success or failure would depend on whether love could prove stronger than the accumulated hatred of decades, whether wisdom could triumph over the seductive certainty of violence, whether two brothers could find their way back to each other across 28 years of separation and sorrow. The battle erupted with the sudden violence of a mountain storm. As the sacred fire spread through the ancient stone circle, some of Grimm's men broke completely from the curse's influence and fled into the night. Others, too deeply corrupted to break free, attacked with the desperate fury of those fighting for their very existence. Steel rang against steel as Jorund found himself defending the ritual site while simultaneously battling the darkness, trying to consume his soul. Skarr moved like grey lightning among the attackers, his powerful jaws finding throats and hamstrings with surgical precision. The wolf seemed to understand that this was more than just another fight. This was the moment that would determine whether his master remained the man who had raised him or became something else entirely. But it was Era who made the first crucial sacrifice. As Jorund struggled to maintain his grip on both the sacred fire torch and his brother's corrupted blade, one of the iron wolves broke through Skarr's defense. The warrior's sword swept toward Jorund's unprotected back, its edge gleaming with the same dark energy that powered the cursed weapon. Ira threw herself between them. The blade took her in the chest, driving deep between her ribs, but her sacrifice bought Jorund the seconds he needed to complete the next phase of the unbinding ritual. As her life's blood soaked into the sacred stones, something extraordinary happened. The ancient fire didn't just burn brighter, it began to sing. The sound was unlike anything in the natural world, a harmony that spoke of accumulated wisdom and willing sacrifice, of love that transcended death and knowledge that endured beyond the flesh. It was the voice of every circle member who had ever given their life for something greater than themselves, welcoming Ira into their eternal fellowship. "The Echo Stone," Torvald shouted over the chaos, pointing to a crystal formation at the circle's heart that had begun to resonate with the sacred fire's song. "Use it. Speak directly to what remains of his soul." Jorund pressed his hand against the Echo Stone, feeling its ancient power amplify his voice until it could pierce even the curse's spiritual armor. But what emerged wasn't words. It was memory, emotion, the pure essence of brotherhood that had existed before corruption touched their family. The sound that emerged from the stone carried him back to childhood summers when he and Grimm had explored the forests around their home, building kingdoms out of fallen logs and fighting dragons that existed only in their imagination. It carried the laughter of two boys who had shared everything. Secrets and dreams, and the unshakable certainty that they would always protect each other. "I remember," Grimm gasped, tears streaming down his face as the Echo Stone's power reached him. "I remember why I wanted to be strong, not to destroy, but to keep you safe, to keep everyone safe." The cursed blade in his hand began to crack, hairline fractures spreading across its dark surface as the original purpose behind his corruption reasserted itself. The weapon had fed on his protective instincts, twisting them into something monstrous, but now those same instincts were turning against their perverter. Around them, the remaining Iron Wolves staggered as their leader's internal battle affected them all. Some fell to their knees, clutching their heads as decades of suppressed guilt suddenly crashed over them like avalanches. Others simply stood transfixed, watching their commander fight for his soul, with the fascination of men seeing their own possible redemption. "Fight it, brother," Jorund urged through the Echo Stone's amplified voice. "You're stronger than the darkness. You always were." But even as Grimm's true nature began to reassert itself, the curse made one final, desperate gambit. The blade's cracks suddenly sealed themselves, its dark radiance blazing with renewed fury as it drew power from an unexpected source, the accumulated pain and guilt of every life it had claimed through its wielder's hands. "It's feeding on his remorse," Hera whispered from where she lay dying among the sacred stones. "Every person he killed while cursed, every innocent destroyed. The blade is using his grief against him." The revelation almost shattered Jorund's concentration. How could love overcome not just corruption, but the accumulated weight of decades' worth of atrocities? How could forgiveness reach across a chasm filled with innocent blood? But then Skarr did something extraordinary. The wolf, bloodied from his battles with the Iron Wolves, limped over to where Grimm knelt struggling with the cursed blade. Instead of attacking, he placed his massive head against the corrupted man's shoulder and simply waited, offering the same patient acceptance he had always given Jorund. The gesture broke something fundamental in the curse's structure. Here was trust offered without condition, loyalty given without judgment, the simple presence of a creature that saw past surface corruption to the soul beneath. Skarr didn't care about the decades of darkness. He remembered the boy who had once scratched behind his grandfather's ears and shared portions of his meals with any animal brave enough to approach. The cursed blade screamed as its hold weakened, its dark runes writhing like living things in their death throes. But it still had one card left to play. If it couldn't preserve itself through continued corruption, it could at least ensure that its destruction took both brothers with it. The weapon began to glow with unstable energy, building toward an explosion that would consume everything within the sacred circle. Jorund had perhaps seconds to complete the unbinding ritual before they all died in a blast of corrupted power. But as he reached for the final phase of the ceremony, he realized with cold certainty that someone would have to contain the explosion manually, holding the cursed blade while its accumulated malice tore them apart from within. The choice between saving his brother and preserving his own life was no choice at all. Jorund reached for the unstable blade without hesitation, but his brother's hand intercepted his. "No," Grimm said firmly, his voice clear for the first time in decades. "This is my burden to bear, my curse to break." But as their hands closed around the weapon together, something neither of them had anticipated occurred. The Unity Crown, a manifestation of circle leadership that existed more as spiritual reality than physical object, materialized above Jorund's head, its radiance washing over both brothers with transformative power. The crown was everything the cursed blade was not. Where the weapon absorbed light, the crown radiated it. Where corruption sought to divide and conquer, the crown's power unified and strengthened. Most importantly, it granted Jorund access to abilities he had never known he possessed, gifts that had lain dormant until this moment of supreme crisis. "Together," he said, understanding flooding through him as ancestral wisdom awakened. "The curse can't be broken by destroying it. It has to be transformed." Through the Unity Crown's power, Jorund could see the spiritual architecture of his brother's corruption. The curse wasn't just darkness imposed from outside. It had grown from the twisted remains of Grimm's noble intentions, feeding on his desire to protect others until that protective instinct became indistinguishable from the need to destroy threats. "I can see it too," Grimm breathed, wonder replacing the anguish that had marked his features for so long. The path back, it was always there, hidden, beneath the hatred. Working together, the brothers began to untangle the spiritual knots that had bound Grimm for 28 years. Each memory of violence was paired with its original protective impulse. each act of destruction revealed as the corruption of an impulse toward preservation. The process was agonizing, reliving decades of atrocities while simultaneously experiencing the love that had initially motivated them, but it was also liberating. The cursed blade fought their efforts with increasing desperation, its accumulated malice lashing out at anything within reach. Several of the remaining Iron Wolves collapsed, overwhelmed by the spiritual feedback from their breaking connection to the weapon's power. But others found themselves freed for the first time in years, remembering who they had been before corruption claimed them. "The sacred fire," Torvald called out, his voice carrying over the chaos. "Feed the transformation through the flame. Let the ancestors guide the cleansing." The eternal fire had spread throughout the stone circle now, its silver radiance revealing hidden chambers and passages that spoke of this place's true significance. This wasn't just a waypoint. It was one of the circle's most sacred sites, a place where spiritual surgery had been performed for generations. As the brothers channeled their combined will through the sacred fire, the cursed blade began to change. Its dark metal lightened, corruption burning away like dross in a forge, revealing the pure steel beneath. The evil runes that had covered its surface dissolved, replaced by inscriptions of protection and healing that had been hidden for decades. But the true miracle occurred when the transformation reached the blade's spiritual core. Instead of simply destroying the curse, their combined effort was purifying it, turning accumulated malice into protective power that could be wielded for good rather than evil. "Impossible," one of the Iron Wolves whispered, his own corruption beginning to crack as he witnessed redemption made manifest. "Not impossible," Ira said from where she lay among the sacred stones, her voice weak but filled with joy. "This is what the circle was always meant to accomplish. Not the destruction of darkness, but its transformation into light." The Unity Crown's radiance grew blinding as the ritual approached its climax, but through its illumination, Jorund could see beyond the immediate moment. He saw communities rebuilding under the guidance of a restored circle, saw knowledge flowing freely between settlements as the old networks of wisdom were re-established. He saw his brother not as the corrupted leader of the Iron Wolves, but as a protector who could defend the innocent without becoming monstrous himself. "The new circle stone," Torvald breathed, pointing to where the purified blade was beginning to dissolve into crystalline light. "It's forming, a new foundation for everything we've lost." The weapon that had caused so much destruction was becoming something else entirely, a crystal formation that pulsed with the combined spiritual energy of sacrifice, redemption, and hope. It would serve as the cornerstone for a rebuilt circle, a tangible reminder that even the deepest corruption could be healed if love proved stronger than hatred. As the transformation completed, the Unity Crown settled onto Jorund's head with a weight that felt both heavy and light, the burden of leadership balanced by the support of those who would share it. Around him, the surviving Iron Wolves knelt, their own corruption burned away by proximity to such powerful healing. "My brothers," Grimm said, addressing his former followers with tears streaming down his face, "we have much to atone for, much to rebuild. But if these two old people and one hermit can accomplish this miracle, then perhaps even we can find redemption," one of the warriors finished, wonder and hope warring with shame in his voice. The battle was over, but the real work, rebuilding trust, healing communities, and proving that the circle's return would benefit rather than threaten the world, was just beginning. The morning after transformation, the sacred waypoint looked like a different place entirely. Where curse-corrupted warriors had stood ready for battle, men and women now worked together to build something new. The former Iron Wolves moved with the careful deliberation of people rediscovering their humanity. Their hands that had once wielded weapons with deadly skill now employed in gentler tasks. Gathering firewood, preparing food, tending to the wounded with a compassion that surprised them all. Era lived, though her recovery would be long. The sacred fire's power had preserved her life when mortal healing failed, marking her as one blessed by the ancestors themselves. She spent her strength teaching the newly awakened former warriors about the healing arts, sharing knowledge that transformed destroyers into protectors with patient wisdom. "The irony isn't lost on me," she told Jorund as they watched Grimm instructing his men in the proper way to approach traumatized communities. "Those who cause the most damage may become our most effective ambassadors. Who better to speak of redemption than those who have experienced it firsthand?" The new circle stone had taken root in the waypoint's center, its crystalline structure growing larger each day as more people touched it with genuine intent to serve rather than rule. Unlike the old circle's rigid hierarchies, this new foundation seemed designed to accommodate different approaches to wisdom, different ways of serving the greater good. Torvald spent his days working with the Chronicle, updating its pages to reflect the changed world they now inhabited. But alongside the traditional genealogies and prophecies, new sections were emerging, accounts of redemption achieved, techniques for healing spiritual corruption, and most importantly, guidelines for preventing the mistakes that had led to the Circle's destruction. "We were too insular before," he explained to Jorund as they planned the journey to contact other survivors. "Too convinced of our own righteousness, too unwilling to question our methods. This new circle will be different, more humble, more willing to admit when we're wrong." Jorund wore the unity crown only during formal ceremonies, the rest of the time preferring to be seen as a man among equals rather than a figure apart. But even without visible symbols of authority, his leadership was evident in the way problems gravitated toward him for resolution, how disputes calmed in his presence, and how hope seemed to follow in his wake. "You're becoming what your father always hoped to see," Grimm told him during one of their evening conversations. "A leader who serves rather than commands, who builds bridges instead of walls." The relationship between the brothers remained complex. Too much had happened for simple forgiveness. Too much pain had been caused for easy reconciliation. But they were building something new together, a bond forged through shared sacrifice and mutual redemption that ran deeper than blood alone. "I dream about them sometimes," Grimm admitted, referring to the innocent people who had died by his corrupted hands. "The families destroyed, the communities torn apart. The Crown's power lets me see how their stories might have unfolded differently." "And what do you see?" Jorund asked gently. "Children who might have grown up to be healers, leaders who could have brought peace to their regions, innovators whose discoveries might have benefited everyone." Grimm's voice carried the weight of irreplaceable loss. "But also their descendants, generations yet unborn who might find hope because we chose redemption over continued destruction. The surviving Iron Wolves faced their own reckonings as memories of their true selves emerged from decades of suppression. Some couldn't bear the weight of what they had become and chose exile, seeking to atone through solitary service in the world's remote places. Others threw themselves into the work of rebuilding with the fervor of the truly converted, their intimate knowledge of violence making them unexpectedly effective teachers of peace. Skarr had appointed himself guardian of the entire camp, his presence serving as a calming influence on both former enemies and new allies. The wolf seemed to understand that his role had expanded beyond protecting a single hermit to helping shepherd an entire movement back toward the light. As spring approached and travel became possible again, messengers began arriving from the scattered circle families. Word of the Unity Crown's manifestation had spread through networks of communication that had lain dormant for decades, carried by travelers' tales and the dreams of those sensitive to spiritual resonance. 12 confirmed, Torvald reported after. The latest group of visitors departed. 3 more families sending representatives to evaluate our claims, and rumors of others emerging from hiding, people who thought they were the only survivors. The new circle stone pulsed with increasing frequency as more people added their commitment to its growing structure. Each pledge of service strengthened the foundation, each act of genuine sacrifice added to its power. But unlike the old circle's emphasis on bloodline and tradition, this new organization welcomed anyone whose heart was aligned with its mission of service and protection. "We'll make mistakes," Jorund acknowledged during the ceremony that formally established the restored circle. "We'll face challenges our ancestors never imagined, deal with problems that don't have traditional solutions, but we'll face them together, with humility and wisdom learned through suffering." The ceremony itself was simple. No elaborate rituals or lengthy speeches, just people pledging to serve something greater than themselves, while standing around a crystal that had been born from the transformation of hatred into hope. As the sun set behind the mountain peaks, its light refracted through the new circle stone into a rainbow that painted the snow in colors of promise. That night, as Jorund stood watch over the sleeping camp with Skarr at his side, he reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. 3 months ago, he had been a hermit whose greatest concern was surviving another winter alone. Now he carried responsibility for rebuilding an ancient tradition while adapting it to a changed world. The weight should have been crushing, but it felt surprisingly manageable. Perhaps because he wasn't carrying it alone, every person sleeping peacefully around the new circle stone shared part of that burden. Every act of service lightened the load for all. In the distance, wolves howled their eternal song to the mountain stars, and for the first time in decades, their voices carried no threat of loneliness. The pack had been restored, the circle completed, and tomorrow would bring new opportunities to prove that wisdom could indeed triumph over force, that love could overcome even the deepest corruption. The hermit was dead, but the man who had taken his place was very much alive, surrounded by family both found and redeemed, carrying the future forward on shoulders strong enough to bear its weight.